They thought it was funny. At my parents' long oak dinner table, polished to a shine, my husband asked politely for the bread. His voice carried the accent of his childhood, steady but unmistakable. My father smirked. My mother's lips twitched. And then, in front of every guest, my father leaned back in his chair and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Imagine this man in front of a judge. They'd need subtitles just to understand him." The laughter was instant. A ripple down the table, nervous at first, then emboldened. Wine glasses trembled, forks clinked, and the warm air of roasted beef and garlic bread turned sour with humiliation. My husband didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply lowered his gaze to his plate, calm and composed. But me? I heard everything. The scrape of a chair leg across hardwood, the hollow echo of a guest clearing their throat, the cold tick of the clock on the mantel. That exact line, subtitles in court, seared itself into my memory. It was meant as a joke, a performance. But what my parents didn't know was that one day those words would return. Not in a dining room full of neighbors, not in whispers or laughter, but in a courtroom, under oath, where polish meant nothing and truth carried the only weight. That night they thought they had silenced him. Instead, they gave him the very weapon that would undo them. Tell me, what would you have done in that moment? Sat there in silence or spoken up? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you believe respect should never be mocked, hit that like button and subscribe. I've worn a uniform most of my adult life. The Marine Corps taught me how to keep my boots shined, how to carry myself with confidence, and how to survive when the world felt hostile. But nothing in that training prepared me for the battlefield that was my parents' dining table. From the outside, our family looked polished, perfect even. My father was a retired colonel who still carried himself as if he were about to inspect the barracks. My mother prided herself on her charm, her perfect hosting skills, her ability to turn any social gathering into an audition for status. Together they believed in one thing above all else: appearances. Everything had to look sharp, controlled, proper. I had grown up in that environment, learning quickly that being different was something to be corrected, not celebrated. When I married my husband, I knew there would be friction. He was everything my parents didn't understand. He wasn't born here. He'd immigrated in his 20s, joined the service, and earned his naturalization through sheer discipline and loyalty. He had deployed twice as a linguist, serving with Marines who relied on his translations in villages most Americans couldn't pronounce. Later, he trained in military law, learning the rules of evidence, the articles of the UCMJ, the structure of justice in a system that demanded precision. His mind was sharp, his discipline unshakable, but he carried something my parents couldn't ignore: an accent. It wasn't thick enough to make him unintelligible. Anyone who listened for more than a sentence could understand him perfectly. But in my parents' world, where proper English was part of the uniform, his accent was treated like a dent in the armor. Every word he spoke was another excuse for them to smirk, to exchange a glance that said he doesn't belong here. When we first began dating, I kept hoping they would grow past it. I thought if they saw his discipline, his patience, his brilliance, they would realize he was the kind of man they claimed to admire. But admiration in my family had never been about truth. It was about image. And an accent, no matter how small, no matter how irrelevant, was an image flaw they couldn't forgive. The tension became obvious in small moments. My father would correct him, repeating a word with exaggerated emphasis, as if teaching a recruit how to salute. My mother would laugh too quickly at one of his jokes, then glance around the table as if to make sure everyone else understood what he meant. They thought they were subtle. They weren't. At first I defended him, I pushed back. But every time I did, the air grew colder. My father would fold his hands and lean back, the way he did when a junior officer questioned him. My mother would smile sweetly and change the subject, as if my objections were just an overreaction. Slowly I realized what every child of my household eventually learns. You don't win by arguing. You win by waiting. You wait for the moment when truth proves itself louder than appearances. The breaking point came when my parents invited us to what they called a family dinner. In reality, it was a showcase. They'd invited not just relatives but colleagues from the local community, friends from church, old military acquaintances, neighbors who admired their spotless lawn and perfect house. For them it was an opportunity to perform the role of proud parents. For me it was a trap. I knew it the moment we walked in. My mother greeted us with her trademark smile, the one that looked more like a mask than an expression. My father clasped my husband's hand a little too hard, his eyes lingering just long enough to remind him that this was his territory. The table was set with military precision, silver polished, napkins folded, wine glasses perfectly aligned. Every detail screamed that this wasn't just dinner, it was an inspection. And my husband, calm as always, didn't flinch. He thanked them, complimented the roast, pulled out my chair before sitting down. His manners were impeccable. His composure was steady. But as soon as he spoke, just a simple, "It smells wonderful, ma'am," I saw it. The flicker in my mother's eyes, the tightening of my father's jaw. The performance had begun. For them, my husband's accent wasn't just a sound, it was a flaw to exploit. And tonight, in front of their carefully chosen audience, they were going to test just how much they could get away with. I sat there in my dress blues, watching the scene unfold, the way I might watch a patrol enter an ambush zone. Every detail mattered, the gleam of the wine bottle, the nervous cough of a neighbor, the way my husband's shoulders remained relaxed even as the first barbs came. I didn't know exactly how the night would end, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty: my parents had underestimated him. And in our world, whether on the battlefield or at the dinner table, that was the first step toward their own defeat. Dinner began the way so many of my family's dinners had: polished, practiced, and suffocating. My mother poured wine with the grace of a seasoned host, her bracelets catching the chandelier light as if to remind everyone at the table how carefully curated her life was. My father carved the roast with the precision of a man who had once commanded young Marines to shave seconds off their rifle drills. Everything about the setting was designed to signal control, tradition, superiority, but control is a fragile thing. It only takes a spark to show how much of it is an act. The first spark came when my husband asked politely for the potatoes to be passed. His pronunciation of potatoes carried the faint lilt of his birthplace. Clear, understandable, but undeniably foreign. My father handed him the dish, and with a smirk so faint only I noticed, repeated the word back, stretching the vowels just slightly, as if mocking him in slow motion. The guests laughed. Not loudly, not cruelly, but with that nervous chuckle people use when they know the host expects it. My husband only smiled in return, unbothered, and thanked him. His composure was intact, but mine was cracking. I tightened my grip on the stem of my glass until my knuckles turned pale. Then came the second spark. My mother leaned in across the table, voice dripping with sweetness. "It's wonderful that you're picking up English so well, dear," she said. "When did you first start learning?" It wasn't curiosity, it was theater. My husband answered calmly, "When I joined the service, ma'am." Language was survival. Mistakes were costly. The way he said it, measured, deliberate, should have silenced the table. But one of my father's old Marine buddies chuckled and added, "Costly? I bet the translators in those villages understood you better than us tonight, huh?" Another ripple of laughter. This time, even my mother laughed along, her hand covering her mouth as if that would soften the cruelty. I scanned the table like I'd scan a battlefield. Some of the younger guests looked uncomfortable. A cousin shifted in her chair. One of my father's neighbors stared down at his plate, pretending to be absorbed by the gravy, but no one spoke up. No one interrupted the performance. They let the mockery hang in the air like smoke. Through it all, my husband never lost his calm. He didn't snap back. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he asked my cousin about her studies, asked my father's neighbor about his new job. He redirected every jab into a polite question, every laugh into an opportunity for someone else to speak. His dignity became a mirror, reflecting their cruelty back at them in silence. But silence can cut both ways. For me, each laugh landed like a blow. I had spent years learning to control my reactions in uniform, learning that sometimes silence was a weapon, sometimes it was a shield. But in that room, silence felt like betrayal. I wanted to slam my hand on the table, to remind them who this man was, that he had sat in briefing rooms where every word mattered, that his translations had saved lives, that he had stood in courtrooms applying the very rules they pretended to respect. Instead, I sat motionless, jaw tight, every muscle taut, because I knew the truth. You don't win battles like this by shouting across a table. You win them by letting arrogance write its own indictment. The mockery escalated as the wine flowed. My father interrupted him mid-sentence to correct the way he pronounced jurisdiction. My mother exaggeratedly repeated strategy after him, turning the word into a private joke between herself and the woman beside her. A guest asked him to say that again, slower, as if his words were entertainment, and still he held steady. His fork moved with precision. His posture never slouched. His tone never wavered. He looked every bit the officer I knew him to be, disciplined, composed, anchored in quiet strength. But as the meal drew on, one particular moment burned itself into my memory. My father raised his glass, tapped it with a spoon, and grinned at the table. "Let's toast," he said, to clear speech, strong voices, and keeping tradition alive. He looked directly at my husband when he said it. The table erupted in polite applause, glasses clinking, laughter bouncing off the polished walls. And in that chorus of mockery disguised as celebration, I saw the shift. My husband's eyes narrowed, just slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. He wasn't humiliated. He was recording every word, every smirk, every nervous laugh. He was letting them build the very case they would one day answer for. I realized then, he wasn't enduring their cruelty out of weakness. He was enduring it out of discipline. He was waiting, and when the moment came, he wouldn't need to raise his voice to end their performance. The truth would do it for him. And my parents, so certain of their control, had no idea they were giving him the evidence. There's a rhythm to mockery. It starts with little jabs, disguised as jokes. It builds with repetition, gathering confidence each time no one pushes back. By the end, it doesn't even bother with disguise. It comes out sharp, direct, meant to wound in front of witnesses. That night, the rhythm reached its final beat. The meal had dragged into its second hour. The plates were cleared, the candles burned low, and the wine had softened the edges of conversation. My mother leaned back in her chair, her smile thin, her eyes darting like a conductor, ensuring the orchestra followed her lead. My father, as always, relished the spotlight. He set down his glass, clasped his hands together, and leaned forward as though addressing a company of Marines before a field exercise. "Let me ask you something," he said loudly, directing it at my husband but pitching his voice so everyone at the table would hear. "What would happen if you stood in front of a judge and tried to make your case with that accent? They'd need subtitles in the court transcript just to understand you." It was the line he had been building toward all evening, the punchline rehearsed in his mind long before we arrived, and it landed exactly as he wanted. The room burst into laughter. Some threw their heads back, others hid their smiles behind napkins, but the effect was the same, a chorus of amusement at my husband's expense. I felt it like a physical blow. My chest tightened, my jaw clenched, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Around me, the sound blurred into a single ugly noise. Forks tapping, glasses clinking, laughter echoing against polished wood. A scene I'd seen before, different details, same pattern, power protecting itself by cutting someone else down. My mother, as if to soften the cruelty, added her line. "Sweetheart, you know we love you, but some accents just don't belong in certain rooms." She said it with the gentle tone of a woman offering advice, but her eyes were sharp, watching the reactions of the guests. She wasn't protecting him, she was managing optics. I looked at my husband. He didn't flinch, he didn't drop his gaze, he didn't even shift in his chair. He met my father's stare with calm eyes, nodded once, and said simply, "Perhaps, sir, but I have spoken in court before." The room went silent, caught off guard by his steady tone. My father chuckled awkwardly, as though to wave it off, but the damage was done, not to my husband, but to them. They had overplayed their hand. They had turned dinner into a spectacle, laughter into evidence, and he had refused to give them the reaction they wanted. For me, the moment felt like the click of a safety coming off. Everything snapped into clarity. The details imprinted themselves into my mind like an intelligence report. The exact phrase my father used. The way my mother smiled when she delivered her line. The ripple of laughter. Who joined in. Who stayed silent. The time on the mantel clock. 21:47. I was recording it all. Not because I planned to argue with them that night. Arguing with my parents was like shouting into a storm. But because I knew deep down, this wasn't the end of the story. The very words they used to mock him would one day be the words that unraveled their carefully built facade. The rest of the dinner moved forward on autopilot. Plates of dessert arrived, coffee was poured, conversations drifted to weather and sports. But underneath it all, the memory of that moment lingered, heavy and undeniable. Guests avoided my husband's eyes, some out of guilt, some out of shame. My mother busied herself stacking plates. My father launched into a story from his deployment days. The performance had resumed, but the mask had slipped. When we finally left, walking out into the cool night air, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was sharp, focused. He slipped his hand into mine and gave it a light squeeze. He didn't need to say anything. I already knew. He had endured the humiliation with patience. But endurance wasn't surrender. It was preparation. That night, as I hung up my coat and watched him carefully place his shoes by the door, I understood something I hadn't seen clearly before. He wasn't waiting for respect. He was waiting for the right arena. And when the time came, it wouldn't be at a dinner table with cheap wine and forced laughter. It would be in a room where words carried weight, where protocol mattered more than polish, where my parents' arrogance couldn't shield them. They thought his accent was a weakness. They had no idea it was about to become the instrument of their undoing. The weeks after that dinner settled into a tense quiet. My parents acted as if nothing had happened, as if mocking my husband in front of neighbors and colleagues was just part of the evening's entertainment. They sent polite texts about church events, left cheerful voicemails about upcoming holidays. It was their way of rewriting reality, pretend the wound didn't exist, and maybe it never would. But then came the summons, not to another dinner, but to court. The dispute was classic, my parents petty on the surface, but tied to their obsession with image, a property boundary disagreement with a neighbor. They couldn't simply negotiate, they had to win. They had to be seen as right, righteous, unshakable, and because they couldn't resist dragging me into it, they insisted we attend. Family unity, my mother said, show of strength. What she meant was, we want witnesses to our victory. Walking into that courtroom, I felt a familiar shift. The air was cooler, sterile. The chatter was subdued, replaced by the shuffle of papers, and the muted coughs of strangers waiting their turn. This wasn't a dining room dressed in polished silver. This was an arena governed by rules, procedures, consequences. My parents didn't seem to notice the difference. My father adjusted his tie like he was donning a uniform. My mother smoothed her skirt and plastered on her public smile. They thought they were on stage again, but this wasn't their stage. When the session began, their attorney presented their case with confidence. He spoke of boundaries, easements, local ordinances. My father
father nodded along, glancing around the room as if expecting admiration. My mother occasionally leaned over to whisper, her voice sharp but her expression serene. They were in their element, until the neighbor's attorney requested testimony. That's when my husband's name was called. I saw the flicker of irritation on my parents' faces. They hadn't expected him to be involved. But the neighbor's counsel had listed him as someone who'd been present during a key exchange, an overheard conversation in which my father had bragged about pushing the line back a few feet. Nobody will notice. It was casual, said over a barbecue, but it mattered. And my husband, who noticed everything, had remembered. He rose slowly, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the witness stand. For a moment, the courtroom was just another dinner table. I felt my stomach tighten, bracing for the smirks, the whispers, the same mockery replayed in a new setting. My parents leaned forward slightly, as if preparing to enjoy the show. Then he began to speak. His accent was there, of course, unmistakable, shaped by the language of his childhood. But his words were steady, precise, carried with the cadence of someone trained in clarity under pressure. "Yes, ma'am," he told the judge. "I was present at the barbecue on June 14. Colonel Stoll stated, quote, 'We'll just move the fence line back a little. No one will care.' He said this in front of at least 6 witnesses. The courtroom stilled. The judge's pen paused mid-note. The attorney shifted, recognizing the weight of the words. This wasn't dinner chatter. This was testimony. And testimony, unlike gossip, carries consequence. My father's face reddened instantly. My mother's smile froze in place, a mask cracking under the pressure. They both turned to me, searching for rescue, but I didn't move. I just watched. My husband continued. Calm, methodical, unhurried. He cited the exact date, the placement of chairs in the backyard, even the color of the cooler where the drinks had been stored. His memory was photographic, his delivery unshakable. The judge leaned forward. "Captain, just to be clear, you are testifying that Colonel Stoll knowingly admitted to altering the fence line?" "Yes, Your Honor." Those were his exact words. I have no doubt. It wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. With the formality of a report, the clarity of a professional who understood that precision saves lives, careers, and reputations. His accent wasn't a weakness here, it was irrelevant. What mattered was his discipline, his refusal to let arrogance rewrite facts. And in that sterile courtroom, those facts hit harder than any insult ever could. The neighbor's attorney seized the moment. Documents were entered, maps displayed, the judge asked more questions. Each time, my husband's answers were short, clear, undeniable. No embellishment, no theatrics, just truth, delivered with the weight of someone who had nothing to prove. I glanced around the courtroom. Some of the same people who had laughed at dinner were here now. Neighbors, acquaintances, colleagues. I watched their eyes shift, their expressions recalibrate. They weren't laughing, they weren't smirking, they were listening. Intently. Respect had replaced mockery, and then came the sentence that sealed it. The judge looked directly at my father and said, "This testimony is credible, precise, and compelling. Unless you have contradictory evidence, I see no reason not to accept it." The words landed like a gavel before the gavel itself fell. My parents sat back, stunned. The man they had mocked for months, dismissed with smirks and condescension, had just spoken the words that dismantled their case. Their carefully built image of superiority had collapsed in the one place they couldn't control, a court of law. I felt no triumph in that moment, only clarity. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't about winning an argument. It was about truth speaking louder than arrogance, about dignity holding steady when appearances crumbled. And as my husband returned to his seat beside me, calm and unshaken, I realized the truth my parents had never understood. Respect doesn't come from polish, or accent, or performance. Respect comes from standing firm when the moment demands it. When the gavel fell, the sound was final, sharp, decisive, stripping away the last illusion that this was still my parents' stage. Courtrooms don't care about polish or reputation. They care about facts, about testimony that holds under scrutiny. And my husband's testimony had done exactly that. The ruling was simple. The boundary would be restored. My parents were ordered to cover costs. On paper, it was a property dispute settled like countless others. But anyone in that room knew the outcome was about more than land. The silence afterwards said it all. The same people who had chuckled at my father's jokes during neighborhood barbecues, the ones who had sat at my mother's table and joined in the nervous laughter at my husband's expense. They weren't laughing now. They were whispering, heads bent close, eyes darting toward my parents. Words like embarrassing and arrogant carried easily in the hushed courtroom. For a man like my father, reputation was oxygen. For my mother, it was currency. And in a single afternoon, both had been punctured. When we walked out of the courthouse, the California sun felt harsh, exposing. My parents moved quickly, my mother's heels clicking like a metronome on the stone steps, my father's shoulders rigid. They didn't look at us, didn't speak. For them, the strategy had shifted from denial to damage control. I recognized the posture. I'd seen it on battlefields when a commander realizes the mission has failed but refuses to admit it. Pride becomes a shield, even when the truth is bleeding through. The fallout spread quietly but relentlessly. Within a week, the whispers reached their social circle. My mother's friend from church called me, voice lowered, asking if it was true that my husband had corrected a judge on procedure. A former Marine buddy of my father's stopped me at the grocery store, saying, "Your guy handled himself well in there, cool under fire." He didn't say the rest out loud, but it hung in the air, "Better than your father did." At their next community gathering, the cracks were visible. My father still told stories, still leaned on his colonel's voice, but fewer people laughed. My mother still smiled her perfect hostess smile, but behind it her eyes darted, searching for signs of judgment. Respect is a fragile thing. Once fractured, it never fits back together the same way. As for my husband, he never gloated, he never raised his voice to say, "I told you so." He simply returned to his quiet routines, early runs, careful study of case law, evenings spent reading by the window. When I asked him how he felt about it all, he shrugged lightly and said, "The truth spoke. That's enough." But I knew it was more than enough. It was a turning point. The same accent my parents had ridiculed had become the instrument of their undoing. Not because it disappeared, but because it carried authority they couldn't erase. Every syllable, every word delivered with discipline, had cut sharper than their laughter ever could. The institution, the court, had validated what I already knew, that respect doesn't bow to appearances, it bows to competence, to clarity, to dignity under pressure. And the consequences didn't end with whispers. The judge's written opinion circulated, a matter of public record. Neighbors could read it, colleagues could reference it. My parents' names tied to a failed dispute, their arrogance preserved in black and white. No amount of dinner parties or polished lawns could sweep it away. At home, the air was different. The next time my mother called, her voice was tight, clipped, every word chosen carefully. She spoke to me as if my husband were listening in the background, as if she knew that dismissing him openly was no longer an option. My father didn't call at all. For weeks he avoided me. When he finally did speak, his tone was curt, stripped of its usual superiority. He asked about the weather, about my work schedule, never once mentioning the court. That silence was its own kind of admission. He had lost, and he knew it. For me, the fallout wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about justice. It was about truth finally cracking through the surface. The neighbors who had laughed at dinner now carried a different image in their minds. My husband standing steady in a courtroom, delivering testimony that could not be shaken. That was the picture that would linger, long after the wine glasses and jokes had faded. And for my parents, the lesson was brutal but undeniable. In their world, words at a dinner table were tools for mockery. In the real world, in the world of law and order, words had weight. And when spoken with dignity, even in an accent, they carried more power than arrogance ever could. Life after the courtroom didn't explode into fireworks. There was no parade, no dramatic confrontation, no apology waiting in the wings. It changed in quieter ways, shifts so subtle most people wouldn't have noticed. But for us, those shifts carried the weight of entire years of struggle. The first shift came at home. For years, every visit with my parents ended the same way, with me replaying their words in my head, wishing I'd defended him more, wishing I'd forced them to see his worth. After court, I stopped. Not because they suddenly respected him, but because I no longer needed their approval. The truth had been spoken in the one place that mattered, and they couldn't erase it. My husband's dignity had stood taller than their mockery, and that knowledge built a kind of peace between us. The second shift came in my parents' behavior. They didn't apologize, people like them rarely do, but they adjusted. The next time we saw them, my father avoided direct confrontation. His usual jabs about real Marines and proper English didn't come. He spoke stiffly, like a man walking on ice he knew could crack. My mother busied herself with the dishes, her smile more brittle than usual. Every so often, she would glance at my husband and then quickly look away. It wasn't respect, not yet, but it was recognition, and recognition was more than they had ever given before. What surprised me most was my husband's response. He didn't treat their restraint as a victory. He didn't press the advantage. He simply carried on as if nothing had changed. He was polite, composed, exactly as he had always been. His strength had never been about defeating them. It had always been about refusing to be broken by them. One evening, as we walked back to our car after dinner at my parents' house, I asked him how he managed it. "How can you stay so calm after everything they've said?" He looked at me, his expression steady, and said, "Because their words never defined me. They only revealed themselves." That answer stayed with me. For years I had internalized every jab, every smirk, every subtle dismissal as proof that maybe I wasn't enough, or that we weren't enough. But hearing him say it out loud reframed everything. Their mockery didn't measure us. It measured them, and they had come up short.